So thank you for the introductions. As I've just been introduced, my name is Rebecca and I'm from Covance. For anybody that doesn't know who Covance are, what we do, we actually work with the pharmaceutical industry, so pharma and biotech, so we provide services to help them run their clinical trials. So I'm sure my colleagues in the back corner have heard of us. I actually work in our patient relations department, so it's my responsibility to kind of try and help to bridge the gap between patients, patient groups, and some of the work we do with clinical trials. So as I'm sure you're all aware, that's why you're here today, there's very much a changing landscape at the moment in terms of patients are becoming more aware about their diseases, they're more educated, quite a lot to do with the internet and the availability of information that we now have, and also social media and the ability that we have to interact with each other and learn from people that perhaps may be sharing the same sort of challenges that we are too. There's also a change in terms of the regulatory guidance that's coming through. The FDA making some very kind of strong movements towards actually involving patient voices in some of the research that we're doing, so that we're making drugs that are really useful and important to patients. Okay, so a recent survey that we performed, 84% of the pharma industry, so this is senior executives, felt that patient voice needed to be incorporated into the development of drugs. 71% thought that in the future the patient voice would drive their development and their strategy moving forwards. And 62% thought that by the year 2035, the drug development will actually be significantly dictated to by patients. So how, why would we want to incorporate patients into that clinical trial research arena? So we would, first of all, we would want to approach patients, and we would want to understand the reason for approaching the patients in the first place. Are we coming to them to help us design a clinical study, or are we helping to design actually what the drug might look like in the first instance? And timing is key to that. So actually bringing them in very early into that development stage so that they do have a voice, but not only have a voice, that their voice is actually heard and then actioned upon. We then also need to educate the patients more. The internet is a great place to start, but that's not the only place. You know, the pharmaceutical industries, people like Covance, need to provide additional information to help patients actually navigate that very difficult arena. There's a lot of information out there, and some of it can be hard to digest or even understand at times. Once we've actually engaged with that patient, they have an awareness, perhaps of the research or trial that they want to work with us on, and we've consented them, we actually want to then to keep them engaged and for them to participate in the actual research. So it's about keeping that dialogue going all the way through the particular research trial that you might be working on. And then at the end, that patient's actually invested in time and energy into that research that they've supported, and you know, we should actually kind of come back to them at the end of that and say, was that a valuable experience for you? How were you treated? What did you think about the design of that study? So here you can see that patients are very much at the middle of the engagement ecosystem. So some of the work that we're doing at Covance is to direct patient engagement and have that voice of patients. We're working with scientific and medical experts. We're working with patient advocacy groups, building relationships, and we're also working with some of the health systems, for example, our LabCorp patient care database. So this is an example of where we've actually worked to incorporate some of the voices of patients into the work that we do. So we are running several patient-facing surveys. And this example is one that we've run particularly in rare disease, so I thought it was relevant to bring it here to talk to you about today. So our objectives were to understand the perceptions of patients with rare diseases towards clinical trials. what are the factors that might involve or impact their involvement in participating. And then we would also release a white paper and have some data to actually understand their involvement. So we took an 8-minute online survey against a number of patients that were diagnosed with a mixed rare of different diseases. We surveyed 150 patients, all of them in the US, and that was done between the 8th and 15th of September last year. We've also conducted a number of other surveys, so for example in rheumatoid arthritis, in diabetes, Fabry disease, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, liquid tumours, and we're also currently working on one in asthma. So, the results of the survey. Now these actually really challenged some of our internal perceptions of what we thought patients with rare diseases might be willing to do in order to participate in clinical trials. And if I'm honest, there was a perception that if you suffer from a rare disease, you might be more willing to travel further to find a doctor to treat you, or that you might be even willing to spend more time on the site. And honestly, these results that came back really dumbfounded the team, because the results were no different from somebody that suffers from type 2 diabetes. Clearly, we forgot to kind of factor in that just because you might be suffering from a rare disease, you actually have a life. You might have a family, you might have children, you might have a job, and therefore, you are not actually particularly wanting to travel to a site that's 100 miles away just to get some additional treatment. So here you can see 96 to 83% thought that if there was an additional visit of 1 or 2, that would be acceptable to participate in a clinical trial. However, if we wanted you to come 3 or 4 times in a month, that certainly wouldn't be acceptable to you. And similarly, for time on site, so an extra hour or 2 would be acceptable to this group of patients that were surveyed, whereas if they were asked to spend 3 or 4 hours on site, again, they would certainly not be kind of willing to spend that extra time. Also, the level of comfort with actually participating in a clinical trial. So most people responded that they were happy with biological samples being taken, perhaps to take an electronic diary or a patient questionnaire. But then if we were asking patients to stay overnight, or if we were going to do something like a biopsy, obviously for most of us, those would be more challenging aspects and probably less likely to, to encourage us to actually participate in a trial. And then finally, most participants in the survey were actually very willing to wear a mobile device, such as a Fitbit, which isn't surprising. I have mine on today, so why would anybody not be willing? But it's interesting because actually that's the way the industry is going these days, and there are going to be more wearables and more tech out there for patients to use. Okay, so the biggest challenge for actually participating in a clinical trial was the worry about potential side effects. So nearly 50% of survey respondents thought that side effects would be a major kind of thing that would put them off participating in a trial. Some of the other things were things like inconvenience, the time required, or the uncertainty over insurance coverage. Bearing in mind this is a US audience as well. So really for us to understand the patient journey and to understand why would these patients want to participate in a clinical trial, perhaps it would be to receive additional medical care or a change or better care. Maybe they want to understand their disease more. Maybe they want to help research and help other patients that might be suffering from similar diseases, or maybe they're looking for compensation. Some of the influences that might affect their decision to actually participate, so autonomy in decision making can vary culturally, and they can also depend on the people around them in their care cycle, their spouses, their family and friends and doctors, as to whether they actually would want to participate in a trial or not. And then some of the barriers around that are patients are not necessarily aware of trials. There may be burdens imposed on them from protocols, logistics, discomforts for actually being involved in some of the research. The perceived risks of participation. I mean, we all know, as a patient, you would sign an informed consent form, but they could be 10 pages long, 20 pages long. Are they really actually understandable to a patient? The type of study that's actually involved, the sponsorship for the study, or just that there's no personal benefit for actually participating. So we're using the voice of the patient to better align and integrate the patient into the ecosystem of research. So they're actually becoming the centre of that research and the centre of the research and what we're trying to do, rather than the sites, the doctors being the centre of what we're doing. So this is an example of the Fabry disease study that survey that we ran recently. We actually partnered with 3 different advocacy groups to help us run this survey. They reviewed the questions, they had input into the questions, and then they surveyed that out to their community. Now at the moment the results are still being analysed. We've collected the information, but we're still analysing the results. But this particular sponsor actually did incorporate some of the voices of those patients into the design of the protocol. So whilst things are still changing, we already know, because we were working with that client so early on in the development of that protocol, that we could influence the change of how they were designing their study. So just in general, in terms of advice for the industry, it's really important for us to empower patients in that clinical study process. It's important for us to understand their perceptions and their motivations for taking part in clinical research. It's got to be early and meaningful inclusion of patients, and certainly not paying lip service to it. We really have to acknowledge their input and then action on it. I did speak to a patient advocacy group in the US not that long ago, and they'd worked with a particular sponsor, and they'd gone out and they'd surveyed patients on the protocol design. They'd publicised that, they'd marketed it, they'd said we've done, voice of the patient, but they didn't actually change anything in that particular protocol, that design of that study. You know, so we have to make sure that we're not only asking for their input, but we're actually doing something very valuable with it as well. And then continue to be innovative in our approach in terms of gathering that information, analysing it, and interacting and engaging. So I'll open the floor now to any questions that you might have.